Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Path to Profit with EA. That we are having a conversation live every third Thursday of the month, talking about industry related topics. And today our topic is really talking about private label and creating assortments that scale profitably. I'm really excited to guys have you all on the call. Feel free to drop your comments as well as your questions into the chat. I will try to address them as much as I can on the call. If not, I will definitely get back to you guys with the answer after the call. Really just wanted to start off by introducing myself. My name is Ye. Full name is Evgenia Alexandrovna Yushkova, but everyone knows me as Ye. And I'm a fashion business consultant, and I work with retailers and across the United States, as well as worked with some retailers in Asia to build their private label programs that don't just look good. They scaled and they really worked on protecting their margins and deliver their bottom line growth. Today, we're going to unpack why so many private label assortments are underperforming and how to fix them fast. We get a lot of clients who are coming in with their challenges, and we've seen it all, I would say, at this point. But we do see a big commonality of certain pitfalls that are particularly maybe underlooked because we're constantly going at 100 miles an hour. So we'll talk a little bit about those today, and I'll try to share some real life examples with you as we are unveiling some of these topics. I would like to start off by really thinking about what people really don't say enough in the industry, that private label has really outgrown its original role. It's no longer just margin filler, it's critical growth engine. But there is a problem that we're seeing, that most private label assortments today are fundamentally misaligned with how customers shop, how supply chain operate, and how financial targets are set. Many of you are operating in environments where you are under pressure to improve margins continuously without increasing retail prices, especially now that we're dealing with all this new shifts with tariffs. How are we going to solve for that? It's going to be a good question. You're carrying excess inventory in underperforming styles. A lot of times it's unavoidable, but the question is there a way to take it with and minimize your risk in order for you to be able to minimize that type of inventory? Your teams are reaching out and they actually a lot of times reacting to sales instead of driving them. Trying to going at always at 100 miles an hour, we often see that the teams are scraping and trying to get to the product fast onto the market, but don't spend enough time actually analyzing the sales and data to make the shifts and demands of what's going to happen in the future and predict them. Your private label line, despite being well staffed and designed, might not be also meeting your ROI targets. Now, why is this happening, do you think? And I'd love to kind of really highlight what we're seeing based on our customers that we're working with. A lot of times it's because the assortment structures, as well as the development process and the go-to-market timing, were built in a different time and era. A lot of them were built years ago and often not being refined and relooked, and hardly ever we take a step back and look at everything holistically from end to end to really identify how we can optimize, not just from the assortment perspective, but also looking at the processes. Some of the cracks that we see within the clients that we work with is that inventory aging over 90 days is one of the biggest ones that we're seeing. Markdowns sometimes exceed 25%, and cannibalization of the branded sales with no lift in total category revenue. And teams spending more time chasing what went wrong versus then building what's next. Right now in the US, what we're seeing is reinforced tariffs hitting core categories like synthetic knits, outerwear, footwear, adding huge cost spikes on the landed prices. Retail traffic really softened as well, especially in the mid-tier department store channels. Cash flow crunches really leading to shorter buying window and more exclusively looking at inventory turns and returns on the investments of the capital. So really thinking about how do we overcome some of these challenges in the environment that we're currently today. And as we can see, this environment is quite unpredictable. In this type of environment that we currently are right now, the bloated and really misaligned private label lines is going to be a liability and not an asset. So how do we really solve for this is to think about strategic reset. This workshop that we're doing today is really going to be talking about some initial reset strategies that I'd love to share with you today. It's time to really stop treating private label as a seasonal project or visual merchandising tool. We need to really build private label in the lines that are data informed from inception, are built around roles that support revenue and margin objectives, and are resilient against global sourcing and cost violet. This is really about private label. Thinking of it as a portfolio, not just the product line for the brand and for the retailers, especially. Just like the financials, you are really thinking about every piece of that portfolio. Should it's really generate the profit, right? Where would be the risks and how do we really overcome those risks and where do we unlock the growth? It's really SKU doesn't serve, if the SKU really doesn't serve, one of our purposes, it doesn't really belong into our assortment. And we know that, but a lot of times we know that already after the fact, because we did not take the precautions of how to determine some of those SKUs ahead of time and drop them before we actually went into designing for the next season. Really we want to also think about is your current private label line, is it really designed for scalability and the profitable growth? Or is it just really well-meaning reacting to margin pressures and the line gasps, which a lot of times is what we're seeing. Retailers jump into private label because they're trying to save on margin, because they are being pressured by the consumer to get product at the better pricing. But private label is really not all about that. If you're really building a private label just because based on the delivering a better priced items to your customer, then most likely it will not work. Beyond the price, there has to be a really big value to the customer. And value to the customer comes in through the quality, fit, potentially solving a specific issue that all of your other branded product are not solving for that particular customer. Listening to the customer and be able to deliver the private label that helps to serve their needs is what's going to help us to turn those private label customers into a loyal customer of your brand. It is a customer acquisition machine. It is definitely important to have, but you have to do it and think about how do we do it in a much more strategic way so that it does bring the ROI and doesn't overtie our resources, and at the same time really helps us to build into this customer acquisition machine. If we would like to really, I'd love to really start talking about some of the core issues that we're also seeing. Most private label assortments are built using an outdated playbook designed by really filling the shelves and not scaling the business. In today's environment, that we are really at the dangers of really thinking about how do we become resilient to everything that's happening in the market. In the US market right now, brands are under pressure really from multiple fronts. Tariffs are back into play. It's not just the Chinese imports, right? It's also extends to other countries that are key sourcing hubs. Consumers are pulling back on discretionary spending, but there's still shopping value, and especially on essentials. So thinking about where is your private label positioning in terms of good, better, and best, and whether it's a essential or whether it's a trendy product or whether it's a performance product, really identifying where that position needs to be in order for you to be able to drive maximum value to your current shoppers. And freight, really violently creeps up back on things that are happening around the world and really leading the disruption of the lead times and landed costs. We're starting to see again increase of how long it's taken to get the product in. The container cost is going up. So really thinking about how do we survive and stay resilient in this particular environment. What does all of this might mean for you? Really, it's your assortment is bloated and really misaligned with your demand and your customer preferences, or you're really just building it on a really thin margins. You most likely will bleed profit, before the product even hits the warehouse. And a lot of times we've hyper focused on the product margins, but we underlook the effect and the operational costs that later on will affect our bottom line profitability for that particular private label. We see that more often than you think. So, and that all ties back in, again, taking a step back and looking at all of your processes and whether they are optimized to support your private label initiative. But we'll talk a little bit more about this as we unveil a little bit more of this topic. Where do we really start to play and identify the scalable categories? Before we really talk design and cost, we have to talk strategy. Not even a category is worth building under private label, right? And really, how do we find what's scalable today and what's really important for us to build? We're going to look at 4 pillars. One of them would be high velocity. Asking yourself, can this product move quickly in volume? You do not want to create private label on anything that unless it's a volume drivers. And with a predictable replenishment logic, thinking about knit tops, denim, innerwear, soft accessories, and thinking about how did that ties to essential product for your customer. Because no matter what happens in the world, no matter what happens in the economy, the essential product would still live because people still need essentials. And so focusing our private label on essentials would be the way to go. We're thinking about the margin advantages as a second pillar and asking yourself, is there a minimum of 10 to 15 points margin gap compared to your branded product options? After factoring in tariffs, duty rates, and freight buffers, but also looking at your operational costs. Not every retailer can handle operationally a private label from day one. It sometimes takes a really looking at the under microscope into your processes and seeing whether you have the systems, whether you have the automations, whether you have the resources and staff to be able to support it in the optimal way so that it does not cost you and bleed you more money at the end of the day. The other thing is really thinking about the fit, and the fit is really the key in for the customer to be able to return and be able to buy your brand and your private label. Really thinking about, can you really create the perpetually fit or size experience that really makes the switching to your brand meaningful. Thinking about, what is all of the products that we carry from our branded partners, and really try to find out how does the customer respond to that fit, and finding the opportunities to improve that fit and creating your own fit for the private label that will stay consistent and that would really true to fit to your customer. Again, going back to understanding not just what's happening in the market, but really understanding your customer and not just their preferences, but as well as their size and shapes. And where's the majority of the customer really sits. And every brand is different. There's no brand that has a fit alike. We often underlook that and try to make everybody kind of following a standard fit measurements. And that is where we start to see the pitfalls, because unfortunately, our demographics are not the same. And also depending on your spread of demographic, whether you have majority of your customer coming from West Coast and East Coast versus from Midwest, it's going to be very different curves, very different size ratios that you potentially might want to look at. And really thinking also about the fourth pillar as a customer blind spot. Are you really solving the pain point of the current branded assortment that ignores, like modesty, comfort, inclusive sizing, as an example? Maybe you have an opportunity to integrate where you actually able to have with the new technology, have your customer scan their body with their phone and get their exact size matching that will match to your private label product, and actually be able to give them a true recommendation of what size that they will fit the best to them. I mean, thinking about really outside of the box, that what can you bring with your private label that your branded products do not do? And that's what's going to help us to win this and be successful. Really, let's tie this back a little bit about to what we're seeing in the market as well. For one US specialty chain, we added it their women's bottoms category. And they were investing heavily in the branded cargo pants. But margins after duty and logistics were really under 52%, very thin, not enough to sustain profitably private label initiatives, right? We built a three style private label capsules with flexible waistband, improved fabric and stretch, and we also improved the fit to make sure that it really responds to the comments we've been receiving during the return product. And we able to work out a 70% margin. And that was a game changer for this brand. Within 90 days, it really became their top performing bottom category by revenue and the square foot. Why did this happen? Is because we've listened to the customer. Instead of just investing into the cargo pants that are similar to what our competitors and what their competitors and the branded brands were doing that they were carrying, they heard the customer saying that they're having a hard time with the not having adjustable waistband, and the comfort level for their customer, having a buttoned cargo pant was not an option. And so listening by that and actually delivering a product that did not exist for many of their branded products, but yet still carried the same look and feel and flavor, is what really helped us win this market for this particular client. We didn't chase the trend, as you could see. We found the product gaps where we can be in control of value creation and really scale it in a smart way. So we didn't have to create a huge line. It was really a small capsules that really now become an essential, and our customers of this particular client is keep coming back specifically to buy that pen in multiple colors, in multiple variations, season over season. And so, of course, there has to be an update every season that comes in, but it's a minimal update. Really, it's really more about keeping the fit, keeping the style the customer responds, and updating it with maybe some detailed or fabrication, or potentially a new feature that you potentially might want to add for extra comfort. Constantly improving a comfort and fit is what's going to help us to win this game. Where should you actually invest, on your private label dollars if you start to think about when we think about strategy, and why do we need to do it? It's because the biggest mistake that I see is really in mature businesses and not really in misdesign of products. It's the misallocation of resources into the wrong categories in private label sector is where we often see a biggest pitfall for our mature retailers. Even a well run fashion retailers and businesses, when they launch their private label, being oversaturated and trend sensitive categories is a huge miss, because they're trying to compete with branded products that can have a faster turn, and at the same time it's expected of them to bring in the trend. From private label, because of the value constraints, it is not what we private label should be all about. It's not about trend, it's about essential, it's about the comfort, right? And really, the second pitfall that we're often seeing is really tying up the capital in fragmental and long tail assortments with low margin velocity. We often see that the 80/20 rule, for some reason, is still not applied across a lot of our private label partners that we work with. And why does this happen? Because again, everybody's going to 100 miles an hour, right? You have buyers, and you have, as well as the private label development team, that often work in silos, and then the private label has to be pushed down the throat, I say, to the buyers for them to buy because it's a house brand. But there's not a lot of conversation sometimes happening of what actually the buyers are seeing in the market, where the branded product needs to fill in on top of your private label. I always think of analogy, private label is your bread and butter, and everything else on the branded product, what you put is what you put on top of your sandwich. And so that's the way to think about it, being collaboratively working together between the buying and merchants as well as your private label and design team is going to be very critical. And what we often seeing, it is because those teams work often in the silos, then where we start to see it's those long tail assortments that don't have a big margin, they don't sell as much, and they don't drive 80% of your revenue. So we always say revisit your assortment, look at what 20% drives 80% of your revenue. Everything is a tail that you don't really need to focus on. Probably cut it out and really stay focused and go deep into the styles that are really well performing. As another big pitfall is what we're seeing also is that a lot of the brands are trying, and private label brands especially, are trying to use like a one size fits all approach in category development. When they really need to really tie in, the risks adjustments into their investments, really thinking about different category will have its own capital investment that would need to be in order for you to be able to develop, whether it's a fabric commitments. I mean, wovens, for example, versus knits, very different fabric commitments and MOQs. Looking at as well as how long it's going to actually take into investing in different factories to be able to build out this type of assortments. Looking at where's your lowest investment that can bring you the highest ROI is the key, especially when you're just starting up your private label initiative. And finding the categories that are important to your customer, essential to your customer, and focusing on those is going to be the way to win this. Why does this actually happen? I often ask myself, and I really think it's because the growth pressure creates really reactive decision making. As the retailers grow and they start to really get the momentum, they're under pressure to be able to deliver higher margin product. And so that is when we start to think about and jumping into the private label initiatives. But a lot of times we're not thinking about, are we actually ready to do so? Do we have the systems? Do we have the support? Do we have the process? Often when we are coming in to our client, we then have to really derail and step back and then first fix all of those operational processes and systems, and then make sure that it will support the private label efficiently, so that when we bring in a higher margin product, we're actually not eating up that margin with being not optimized on the operational side for private label initiative. Many retailers today who are currently don't have private label and thinking about it potentially might not be set up for private label. So thinking about how do you do it in a strategic way, in a lean way, so that you don't put huge investments straight up front. You want to test the market first. There's different ways and strategies to do it that I'm always happy to share with you guys as well. Really thinking about going back to those 4 pillars that we've talked about, right? It's the velocity. Can this product move in the volume with really stable demand? If not, scaling will always increase your risks if you are really into the product that is potentially not going to be able to be stable for your demand. So even potentially survey your customer and understand exactly what product do they actually need day in and day out, because that, and invest into that product through the private label would be the right way to do this. Thinking about margin delta, like we've mentioned before, if there is a true like between 12 to 20% points gross margin advantage over your branded alternatives, even after factoring the duties and freight, then the spread, anything that's under 10%, I'm sorry, under 10 points margin, it's really going to be invariable and really not going to make any impact for you, and it will actually make you bleed more money. So thinking about evaluating the potential of, if you are planning to bring this product on a private label, can you deliver at least 20 points margin, higher margin for you of gross margin, for you to be able to bring it in-house and actually see the results, and with the optimized resources and optimized processes, really then bring that into your ROI. Fit and product IP ownership is going to be very critical pillar, like as I mentioned earlier, and really thinking about, can you create a fit block, or, for the fabric handling or construction details that becomes really ownable and consistent across seasons over seasons for your particular brand. So you own the fit. This is something that is one of the number one things that a lot of brands that we see, especially on the private label side, who are coming in from the retail world, who don't have the technical background of fitting and creating the right tech packs for specific and creating the actual standard fit, and be able to just rely on the fits that are coming in from the vendors that they partner up with, is a big miss. So we always say, do not even start designing or creating any product, especially for private label, until you establish your standard fit. And to establish your standard fit, you need to do some homework, you need to do some research, and you need to spend time in fittings to be able to really identify what fit will actually work the best for your customer, and then standardize that and own it to stay consistent no matter who you produce it with. And really thinking about the fourth pillar, like we've mentioned, is the customer blind spot. Is there competition underserving the customers in the way that you can win, right? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to be a notch better than everybody else. That could be the sizing of really inclusively and modesty styles, or it really could be just better value in staple silhouettes. But the value, like I mentioned earlier, it's not about just the price value. It's the value potentially of, maybe it's the quality. Maybe your t-shirt compared to everybody else's t-shirt washes 10 times more, and it doesn't have any pill, or it doesn't change colors, or it never shrinks, or whatever other unique identifier for your particular product will be. That's what's going to be a staple. That's what people are going to love and come back to you season over season for. Again, let's talk a little bit how that really ties back into what's happening in the current environment, right? Where we're seeing that the tariffs are raising, and it's inconsistent. We don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? If tariffs are is unpredictable at the moment. So really thinking about staying consistent and actually constantly checking the HTS codes allocations is going to be super important. The reason is because a lot of times when we don't look at it on a regular basis, I would say even at this point on a daily basis, we might be actually missing some dollars during the times when we're actually deciding to import. We want to also potentially look at the programs, whether, what are the potentially economical shifts that are happening today, so that we can predict to ourselves whether we should hold off on breeding this particular product for this country right now, and better off to breed it in 2 months or a month, because again, if the tariffs will drop and you brought your product at this high tariffs right now, you are going to bleed a lot of money, you're going to lose a lot of money. So thinking about creatively, can you fill in the spots of your inventory with some other product, or product that's coming in from your other hopefully diversified supply chain, that you are in the different regions, so that you could be able to buy yourself time until we kind of get into a more definitive answer of what's happening in the market right now. Retailers are really increasingly competing with their own vendors itself, right? Brands are going direct to consumer now more and more, and then really targeting the customer in a better pricing way, as well as storytelling. So it's not enough for us currently just to create a private label and hope for the best. We have to treat private label like it would be a branded product. We got to be able to tell the story. The customer loves product and brands that they can emotionally connect with. So what is the story that your brand tells that helps you to connect emotionally with your customer and build that loyalty, so that they will come year over year and be a repetitive customer for you? The customers now really are shopping smarter. There's less impulse buys because people are on the budget, as we know. We are seeing this decrease in sales across the border because of that reason. And really thinking about more of a value-based buckets. What can you maybe create some bundles with your private label that really gives the value to the customer, and be able to be less impulsive, but really more shopping for something that they really need essential, and they'll be coming back for you to buy your product. So if you're really launching a private label brand right now, in this environment, you really want to think about, with your private label product, will you save your customer money, right? Will you deliver more value per dollar for that particular customer? Will you strengthen their loyalty, within your platform by sharing a great customer experience with your private label, as well as this branded story? And it's not just looking again, it's not just the margin play, right? It's really about delivering the highest value possible for the price that you are selling to your customer. Looking at one of our retailers that we have worked with in the past, I love always to really share this kind of story with you guys, based on our experience with them. They were building private label brand in outerwear, and then their high ticket, really highly seasonal and heavily promotional products. And then the reason they went with that, because they felt like there was a need for this really seasonal trend product and outerwear that they were not able to get from their branded. They thought it was a void in the market, and that's what they need to focus on. On paper and logically, it made sense because they were filling the gap that theirs weren't able to fill with everyone else. But after really layering all the costs, the warehousing, the long lead times that took them to actually create this trendy product, return rates were super poor. And they were actually, much less getting the loyal customer that they were actually hoping for by doing so. What we did when we came in is we really shifted the focus on two overlooked categories from their overall assortment that drove, based on the analysis, actually drove 20, those 20% that drove 80% of their sales, were knitwear basics. And really, we created more of a bundle pack logic so that their customer liked to buy them in the bundles of, pack of 3, pack of 4, so that they could be able to wear their favorite t-shirt, every day of the week if they need to. And really also looked at a second category is the launched kind of to street loungewear, which was really a hybrid that separated their strong replenishment data, from everything else, that it really separated that category from everything else that they've carried based on their replenishment of how much they've had to actually replenish from the branded product. So we end up doing is, for both categories, we actually used similar and shared fabrics, which helped us to even better get better margins, because we were able to create our knitwear basics in a similar fabrication of our streetwear loungewear, which then we were able to really tap into a higher volume of gray goods, as well as later on we were able to break it into a smaller production runs, and then bring it in more quicker, because we end up also using a the strategy for the supply chain that really allowed us to, instead of pushing the inventory we were able to grab it as needed on demand. We also looked at some of the strategies that really helped uplift their margins. One of them, like I mentioned, we created a shared fabrication that they were able to get on much deeper. But we also did a strategy where we actually reserved the gray goods, and they were sitting in the warehouse of our suppliers, so that we were able to shave off almost 2 weeks of fabric production of gray goods anytime we had to reorder. And because we were working on the module supply chain system operational systems, we were able to now deliver product actually every 2 weeks into our stores to our customers. So that what's helped them to really overcome and drive their revenue up, not only, but as well as their ROI, right? So those are the things that what to think about as you're creating. Are you actually building a private label in the right category that is needed by your customer? The goal isn't just to build more private labels or more products under the private label. It's really about building the right private label, where you can win, scale, and control your outcome. So, before we move on into the assortment planning, I would really want to leave us to think about with a couple of questions. And really, instead of asking ourselves, where are we, um, where are we actually underperforming into our private label, and uh, how can we be making it a little more predictable? We want to ask ourselves where we can be sustainably outperform the market and do it at scale under margin and pressure, right? So thinking about positioning your question in terms of around or the private label factor of thinking about how you can outperform what's happening in the market today is going to be the key. This is the where the most businesses really lose the momentum is in their assortment architecture and assortment planning. So this is what I'd like to spend a little bit more time to really talk about this today. Because a couple of the things that we're seeing when there are some of our retailers for private label creating their assortments that first of all they're too wide, or they're too shallow sometimes as well, or they're not anchoring really by real data. And majority of the times we're seeing that they've been anchored by the trends that are happening in the world out there, by the gut feeling of the buyers, by the designers that are trying to follow again more of a trend versus what essentially needed for the customer, which then allows them to either be too wide and spread out as well as or too shallow. There's not a lot of times when we see assortment structure. And the assortment structure really, one of the strategies that we always use is good, better, and best. Thinking of the 9 box, right? Where does your assortment fits? And how do you build your assortment so that you are able to really capture the customers of all the different levels with your private label, but at the same time not to be spread out everywhere, right? So thinking about the focus and thinking about the categories as well as the number of SKUs that you would be bringing under your private label and controlling that and feeding that to your design department versus a lot of times it's a reverse engineered. We have design departments who come up with all these assortments and then they come in and try to align it with the assortment planners to see how much of it they actually going to buy, which not only that often leads into the over assorting, but also what it also often leads into over spending your resources during the development time. Remember, every hour, every sample is your company bleeding money. So thinking about how do you make it more strategically and build a process that allows your design teams and planning teams and buying teams to work together and be able to do all the planning ahead of time so that when we design into a specific plan so that we don't over design and then later on we don't get ourselves over assorted. Let's break it down a little bit even more. A scalable private label line really needs to be narrow but deep, right? Essentially, now when supply chain really delays and raising the cash flow is really tight, with all this uncertainties, it's much easier going to be to manage a narrow assortment, but making sure that you can be able to go deep in terms of the depth of volume, how much you're going to buy of it, as well as to build around the core silhouettes, like I've mentioned, right? Carrying no more than about 2 to 3 colors per story and expanding it into the next season. That's another big pitfall that we often see is that we carry too many colorways for the private label aspect. Leave the fashion colors to your branded product that you're buying because you can control how much you're going to buy of it and you can be able to manage the inventory much better in that way. Plus, it is a seasonal buys, so they're not going to be your core. So you want to focus on the core, and then the core should never be more than 2 to 3 colors. You give too many choices to the customer, they will not know what to buy. So you got to be very strategic. Should be no or choices, only and choices, And again, the way you will flow in your colors, potentially maybe you have running two colors that are always there, which are your neutrals, and then maybe you have one third color, which is not a fashion color, but something that's a little bit more lighter, seasonal, and fun that you're changing every season or whatever it is. So, I mean, there's different strategies to work on, but thinking about that as well. Are you over assorted, not just in product, but as well as in color? The other time we see a lot of over assortment is fabric types. So, a lot of times we go into private label programs and they have used 10 different fabrics and they constantly changing them and constantly are, R&D new fabrications and new for the new styles. So again, private label, it's not about trend, it's not about but it is about innovation. And so if you have innovated a fabric that does really well and that gives you the performance that you need, then go deep on that fabric. Have your private label wrap around that fabrication. I always say for private label to be successful, and not overspread, we often see, 2 to 4 fabric programs max, but each program will have multiple styles in it, that we could be able to go deep in when we buy so that we can get and leverage of better margins. Also thinking about including the volume drivers, really helps to add on items and margin builders. You need kind of a role for everyday SKU. And so thinking about, can you have an item that is going to be a great add-on to anything that the customer buys, so that it can also sit in your shopping cart, as a recommended product that, hey, with all this products that you're buying from us, this particular product can be really well worn together. Maybe it's let's take it as an example. If you are building a private label on your knitwear basics, kind of the t-shirt line, right? And you are also selling denim and you're also selling outerwear and you're also selling shirts. So one of the greatest things that you could do is you could have that t-shirt pop up on every transaction, on every page of the product, because it's, first of all, your private label. You want to be able to sell as much because it's your highest margin product. But at the same time, you're giving a customer recommendation that, hey, if I'm buying this look of this denim and potentially this shirt, I might want to have this t-shirt that's going to be really cool. If you unbutton my shirt, and it's going to look great, it showed the looks of how it's worn. That helps the customer to say, aha, I probably need that product as well, and they will buy and add that to your cart. And mostly importantly, stop designing based on your line plan and starting designing based on your cart behavior. So this is where, again, the misalignment often happens, is that we create line plans based on trends and what's happening in the market, but we not often tie in or use the data enough. We do always, of course, check the data that we see that across everybody, who, of course, data is important, but we see that often the data analytics are given to merchandisers and as well as to designers, where potentially might not be fully equipped to really take a deep dive into the data analysis. And so they only scratch the surface on which they build the plan. Where we often say is that you got to really get into the data, really analyze it. If you have data scientist team, that would be fantastic. Give that task to them. If you don't have a data scientist team, you can always hire consultants, right? We help you to actually analyze your data and highlight the trends that are needed, to be able to build the line plan effectively that is truly affects what your shopping behaviors and demands are. And that's what the private label really needs to be all about. What's driving the add-on to cart, right? What's leading to upsell behavior? What's causing returns potentially, so that you can avoid some of those pitfalls. So we also want to look at the customer's feedback and really creating a customer feedback loop. And all that data also needs to be integrated as you are creating your assortment plan that's going to go into your designers that they'll design into. And if you're not looking at that data weekly, you're really flying blind. And I've seen merchandising teams that we've come in to help, where they see that data once a week. And that's not that's really, the demand can shift on a daily basis. So you have to really know exactly what's happening within your business, and but make sure you equip the merchandising and design teams with the tools so that they could be able to analyze that data on a granular level, as potentially some of your teams do as well. Really thinking about that most assortments are still built in the visual and seasonal, or kind of environment, or the gut feeling environment. And again, all that has to go away. Everything you design into has to be data driven, and that's what's going to be super important. And this approach, of the gut feeling always sinks your margins, because again, you are usually typically over designing, over assorting, over sampling and so forth. And it also ties up your cash a lot often in the wrong SKUs. When we are designing into the sales data, we minimizing the risk. We know that the customer is responding to X. So if we bring to the market that X in a better way, we will know that that product will sell. Eliminates any type of gut feeling whatsoever. Thinking about, as we're sitting in this leadership roles, right, and we likely dealing with one and more of some of these issues, which would be your team is probably present, with a full colorful line sheets each season, but they're not very clear on the revenue and conversion logic behind how those SKUs were selected. Again, a lot of times the design teams do run in a silo of very minimal access to data or ability to analyze data in a granular way. Um, we often expect creatives to do the work of analytics, and that's where the miss also happens, right? So aligning your process where the analytical team as well as the design team are constantly in sync is always a good way to go, and that would be the winning way to go. Or the assortment is too wide, for example, leading to low depth in per style, slow returns, and really unnecessary markdowns. That's probably also something that you potentially might be experiencing. Or core replenishment items are underfunded, meaning while trends items are really overly assorted, you're tying up your cash and you're not giving enough funds left to actually go deeper on the product that's replenishable, which is your essential, which is your private label, or should be your private label. Or you're potentially approving budgets without knowing what roles of each SKU really plays in deriving the margins and conversions and repeating purchases. So again, going back to that data analytics, right? Going back to how the assortment and the designs were actually derived to for next season. We often see the formula that I'd love to always use. About 60% of your private label assortment should always be a carryover items, strong carryover items, which are your drivers who drive 80% of your revenue. Out of the 40% that's left, I'd say 30% of that should be another reiteration of those proven styles of 60%. Whether you're changing a button, whether you're changing a particular detail, whether you're changing a fabrication and introducing a new style, as it's really not necessarily fully new, but to the customer it's new, it's updated. But it's really more updated on low risk items that you already know that's selling. And only 10%, sometimes even 5% for some of the private labels where it makes sense, is what would reserve for a little bit of fashion trends so that it gives you a little bit of that competitive edge with the branded products. But again, that has to be a strategic way how you're going to do those fashion pieces, right? Maybe it's just the fashion color that you're introducing, and that could be your 10%. Or potentially it could be some sort of a pillar item, which is, good, better, and best. You're probably looking at the best scaled item where it's attention grabber, right? Everybody wants to come see it. Everybody wants to come touch it. Everybody wants to come and click on it. But then when they do, they end up buying all the other product that surrounds it or potentially goes well together. So that could be the strategy that we want to think about as we are doing some of this work. Thinking about some other real life example that I'd love to really share with you guys. We worked with a US direct to consumer brand that had built about 120 SKUs seasonal capsules. Beautiful product, great storytelling, but only 11 SKUs really drove 80% of their revenue. And 42 of them had no clear role in the funnel of sales. They were costing them storage, photography, and marketing dollars. So when we added the cart data, the product return insights, and units per transaction to really re-architecture the line, the outcome that we've had, we cut down their assortment by 40%. We shifted the dollars into deeper buyings of the proven styles. And then we also reworked the merchandising strategy around the add-on items to boost the AOV, right? So within 2 seasons, the blended gross margin rose by 9 points. And inventory aging over 90 days dropped down by 6%. So, I mean, as you could see, this was a really effective way of just strategizing your assortment architecture overall. If the assortment isn't structured around clear financial roles, customer behavior, and SKU purpose, then you are not scaling the business. You're really managing the catalog. Start with what converts. Build in depth, know into the width, right? Really thinking about the depth of the product, and protect your capital by really assessing and assigning every SKU to do the job, right? To actually bring in the revenue. Remember, anytime you R&Ding or anytime you're creating and designing something new, if it doesn't stay live or actually bring you revenue for multiple seasons, then you are now reinvesting another batch of dollars to do new development. Your goal is to reinvest in R&D of the products that will have a longer shelf life, potentially timeless, that with minimal update, you can be able to continue to run and continue save your costs on the development while you are maximizing your ROI at the bottom line. So I really do know we're coming to the top of the hour. I really want to thank everybody that is here. I'd like to answer a couple of questions that were coming in. Thank you, everyone, by the way, for sending the questions. They're really important for us to address as we have in these conversations. I know you cannot speak to me, so sending the questions and comments are the way to do this. And if you are listening to this as a pre-recorded session, feel free to, again, drop the comments of the pre-recording post, and or feel free to reach out to me, or you can book a strategy call. It's absolutely free. I'm happy to go over some of the questions that you might have, because my goal is to provide value to you. The question that came in, Morgan, thank you so much for asking this question. How do we align product roles with financial performance? It's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Really, one of the things what I mentioned is we want to break assortment roles down into 3 buckets. Heroes, which is the high volume, high margin, and they set the tone of your brand. Helpers, which is going to be your mid-value, high margin, often the colors and the fabrics extension, and then the hooks, which really works about low margins but high trend and using sporadically to really attract the attention. So if you kind of reinstate a little bit of what I just spoke about earlier, right? Your hook is that 5%. Sometimes, okay, maybe 10%, but usually it's very minimal. Your helpers would be your remaining of the 30% or 35% of the what you're going to bring in new. And then your heroes is what's going to be the 60% that you're going to carry over your, season over season. Now, do you have to always keep an eye on sales? Yes, because even the hero styles can have a curve, will have a curve, and they'll have a peak and then they will have a drop off. You always want to make sure you catch it at the peak. And then as soon as you start seeing that it's drop off, you might want to retire that style for a bit. Let customer and introduce another, and then change the styles that you're alternatively bringing in. Maybe some seasons you're bringing in one, and then some seasons you're bringing the other, so that it gives a chance for the customer to not see that product, and then when they see it again, it's new and exciting, and they want to buy it again. Really want to thank everybody for this call. I'm really excited to be here with you guys always. I'm here to provide any value. Please do reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you, whether it's positive, negative feedback. I'm learning. I'm learning as I'm doing this recordings as well, so that I could be able to maximize and drive as much value to you and everybody else. Thank you very much. We'll see you next month. It's again, we host this live event every third Thursday of the month at 10 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. The topics that we're going to discuss, they're always different. You will see them on our LinkedIn page at Yushkova Design or Yay Designs. So you could be able to check them out and see them as well. Thank you very much. I will see you guys next time.